The first time I saw my husband after his funeral, he was standing in the frozen food aisle at a grocery store 30 miles from home, and he looked just as shocked as I did. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I just stood there, holding a bag of frozen peas, staring at the man I had buried 3 weeks earlier. He hadn't changed. Same crooked nose from high school football, same dark hair, slightly graying at the temples. Same scar under his chin from the time we tried to install our own kitchen cabinets. Except he looked thinner and terrified. "Claire," he whispered. The bag slipped from my hand and hit the floor. 3 weeks earlier, I had watched them lower his coffin into the ground. 3 weeks earlier, I had stood in black while his parents cried beside me. 3 weeks earlier, I had signed insurance forms, death certificates, and closed his bank accounts. 3 weeks earlier, I had believed my husband died in a boating accident. Now he was alive, and he was pale. "Don't make a scene," he said quickly, pleased. That was a second shock. He wasn't happy to see me. He was afraid of being seen. "Danielle," I said quietly, my throat tightening. "What did you do?" 3 weeks earlier, they told me the boat capsized during a storm. They told me his body was recovered 2 days later. They told me it was quick, closed, casket, water damage. I never questioned it because grief makes you obedient. His parents handled the arrangements. His father dealt with the coroner. His mother insisted I shouldn't see the body. "It's better this way," she said. I believed her. I believed all of them. The funeral was packed. Colleagues, neighbors, family, friends, everyone spoke about how sudden it was, how tragic, how unfair. I cried until my chest felt hollow, and through all of it, there was one detail that never quite settled. No one let me sign anything alone. Daniel's father was always beside me. "Let me handle this," he would say. I thought it was kindness. I didn't realize it was control. Back in the grocery store, Daniel grabbed my wrist gently. "We can't talk here," he whispered. "You're supposed to be dead." "I know. Do you have any idea what you've done to me?" He looked like he wanted to answer. Instead, he scanned the aisle nervously. "Meet me outside," he said, and then he walked away. Just like that, as if disappearing with something he'd practiced. I followed him to the parking lot. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought I might faint. He was standing near an old pickup truck I didn't recognize. He didn't hug me. He didn't apologize. He just looked at me like someone trying to measure damage. "I had to," he said. "Had to what?" "Disappear. You faked your death." "Yes." "For what? Insurance money?" "No." "Then what?" He hesitated. "For you." The words felt like an insult. "You destroyed me," I said quietly. "I buried you." "I know." "No, you don't." He closed his eyes briefly. "If I didn't disappear, you would have been dragged into it." "Into what?" He looked over his shoulder again. "Death." That word landed strangely. "We weren't drowning," I said. "You said the business was stabilizing." It wasn't. 6 months before his death, Daniel had started coming home late. More meetings, more investor pressure, more calls taken outside. I assumed it was stress. I assumed it was temporary. I assumed a lot of things. "You signed personal guarantees," I said slowly. He nodded once. "For how much?" He didn't answer. "For how much?" "Daniel, almost 2 million. The world tilted slightly. "You promised me there were no personal liabilities." "There weren't. Not at first. Then when the second investor pulled out, my breathing became shallow, and you thought faking your death would solve that. If I died, the guarantees dissolved." I stared at him. "You let me believe you were dead to avoid debt?" "No," he said quickly. "To protect you from collection." "Collection? They would have come after you." "They can't." "Collect what's not in my name." "They can if they prove joint enrichment." He had thought this through. He had planned it. He had calculated my grief as collateral damage. You destroyed my life to protect my credit score, I asked. He flinched. It wasn't just that. What else? He looked at me in a way that made my stomach tighten. There were people involved. What people? The kind that don't use courts. Silence fell between us. I felt something. Colder than anger. Fear, double quotes, Daniel. I said carefully. What did you borrow from? He didn't answer immediately. Private capital, that's not an answer. It was short term. How short? 6 months. How much? He looked down. 500,000. My vision blurred slightly. You took 500,000 from someone who doesn't use courts. I thought I could flip the contract. And when you couldn't? I had to remove myself from the equation. Remove. Like he was talking about a faulty engine part. You removed yourself from me. He swallowed. It was temporary. You let me plan your funeral? His voice broke slightly. I watched it. I stared at him. You what? I watched from a distance. My stomach turned. You watched me collapse at your grave. I had to make it convincing. Convincing. That word will never stop echoing. So, what now? I asked. I stay gone. You're standing in front of me. You can't tell anyone. I laughed. A hollow, broken sound. You want me to protect your lie? It protects you. No, I said. It protects you. He looked desperate. If they find out I'm alive, they'll assume I ran with the money. Did you? No. Then where is it? He didn't answer, and in that silence I understood something worse. The money wasn't gone. It wasn't lost. It wasn't stolen. It was misused, Daniel, I said slowly. Did you gamble it? He didn't look at me. You did. It was a hedge. A hedge. It was supposed to double. And when it didn't, I couldn't cover it. The 500,000 wasn't for operations. It was for a desperate, arrogant risk, and when it failed, he chose disappearance. I thought I was saving you, he said. You were saving yourself. He shook his head. They would have come after you to pressure me, and instead you left me widowed. Silence. I lost everything. I whispered. The house, the firm, the future. You got the insurance payout? That was the moment. Something inside me snapped. You planned that. No, you knew it would pay out. He didn't deny it. The insurance policy was $2 million. I had already received the first installment. His parents insisted. I reinvest carefully, his father had even suggested a family trust. Now it made sense. They weren't grieving. They were managing fallout. They knew, or at least suspected. Your parents know, I said. He hesitated. They helped. The parking lot felt suddenly too small. They helped you fake your death. They knew about the debt, and they let me bury an empty coffin. They thought it was the safest option. For who? For the family. I stepped back. I was the family. He reached for my hand. I pulled it away. You don't get to touch me. He looked smaller now, less like a mastermind, more like a scared man who made a catastrophic decision. I never meant to hurt you, he said. That doesn't matter. What are you going to do? I looked at him. For the first time since seeing him, my breathing slowed. I wasn't just grieving. I was thinking, you want to stay dead? I asked. Yes, you want the debt to disappear with you? Yes. You want the collectors to believe there's nothing left to chase? Yes. Then you don't need to disappear. He frowned. What? You need to come back. His face drained of color. Are you insane? No. If I reappear, they'll come for me. Not if you don't owe them. I do. Not if the money was misrepresented. He stared at me. Claire, you said it was an investment loan. Yes. Did you disclose the gambling position? Silence. That's fraud, I said calmly. His eyes widened. They can't enforce illegal contracts. He stared at me as if seeing me for the first time. You'd expose me. I'd expose them. He shook his head. They're dangerous. So are federal charges. Silence, Daniel, I said quietly. You thought the only way to protect me was to disappear. He swallowed. You were wrong. I stepped closer. You don't protect someone by destroying their world. What are you saying? Saying, I replied calmly, you're going to walk into a police station. His eyes widened. You'd turn me in. No, I'd save you properly. The rest of the story unfolded slower. Lawyers, statements, financial disclosures. The private lender turned out to be running unregistered operations. The contract was void. Daniel faced consequences, but not prison, restitution, probation, public embarrassment. The insurance policy was returned. The fraud investigation ended quietly. The collectors vanished. And for the first time since that frozen eye, life felt steady. 6 months later, Daniel and I sat across from each other in therapy, not as husband and widow, but as two people who survived something ugly. I thought dying was heroic, he said once. It was cowardly, I replied gently. He nodded. I know. Trust doesn't come back like lightning. It returns like frost, melting slowly, deliberately, and sometimes not at all. What I learned is this. Some people believe sacrifice means disappearing. It doesn't. It means standing still when consequences arrive. He faked his death to save me. But the real reason wasn't love. It was fear. And fear makes terrible decisions look noble. The day I saw him in that grocery store aisle, I thought my life had shattered again. But it didn't. It clarified. Because sometimes the person you bury isn't dead. They're just hiding. And sometimes the strongest thing you can do is bring them back to face what they ran from. The hardest part wasn't the persecution. It wasn't the legal meetings. It wasn't even explaining to people that my husband wasn't actually dead. The hardest part was deciding whether I still loved him. Because grief is simple, betrayal is not. When Daniel turned himself in, the story made the local news. Entrepreneur faked death amid financial dispute. That headline lived online for months. His parents stopped answering calls. Miranda deactivated her social media. I kept mine active. Not out of defiance. Out of refusal to hide. Because hiding had caused enough damage, the investigation moved quickly. Once the private lender's records were examined, they weren't licensed, they weren't compliant, and they weren't clean. Daniel had been reckless, but he hadn't been criminal. He had been desperate, and pride makes desperate men believe they're strategists. The charges were reduced. Probation, mandatory. Financial restitution for false reporting, community service. No jail time. He stood in court alive. Very much alive. And when the judge asked why he had staged his death, Daniel didn't blame the lender. He didn't blame pressure. He said something I didn't expect. I thought I was protecting my wife, he said quietly. But really, I was protecting my ego. The courtroom was silent. Even the judge solved him slightly. That's an expensive lesson, she said. Double quotes, yes, Your Honor. After court, reporters waited outside. They wanted drama. They wanted tears. They wanted betrayal. Daniel kept his head down. When one of them asked me, did you know he was alive? I answered calmly, double quotes, no. Are you staying with him? That question felt heavier. I'm staying with the truth, I said, and that was all. Therapy was not cinematic. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no tearful embraces. There were long silences, hard questions, and moments when I realized the version of Daniel I loved no longer existed. Because the man I married believed failure meant extinction. The man sitting across from me was learning that failure means accountability. That difference mattered. One evening, months later, we sat in our living room, the same room where I had opened condolence cards, the same room where I had cried into the couch cushion at 2 a.m. Daniel looked around quietly. I watched you grieve, he said. I didn't respond. I thought it would make it easier to stay gone, he continued. It didn't. No. What made you stay? You? I met his eyes. Not because I missed you, he clarified. Because I realized you were stronger than I thought. There it was, the quiet confession. He hadn't faked his death to save me. He had faked it because he didn't believe I could survive the fallout. He underestimated me, just like everyone else. The insurance payout was reversed. The firm dissolved permanently. We sold the house voluntarily, not because we had to, because we needed a place that wasn't built on secrecy. We moved into a smaller home, 15 miles away, less square footage, more sunlight, and fewer ghosts. Daniel found steady work under someone else's company. No personal guarantees, no leverage, no gambling. He checked in with me before every financial decision, not out of fear, out of respect. Trust didn't snap back into place. It rebuilt slowly like muscle after injury. Some days I still wake up and feel that frozen aisle moment in my chest. That shock, that fracture. But I also remember something else. The clarity that followed. The truth is this. When I saw him alive, I thought my world was ending again. It wasn't. It was restructuring. Because the version of our marriage that existed before his death could not survive. It was built on illusion, control, and quiet fear. The version we have now is smaller, messier, more honest. He doesn't make decisions alone anymore. And I don't assume silence means safety. The real reason he faked his death wasn't debt. It wasn't protection. It wasn't even pride. It was shame. He could not imagine surviving public failure. So he chose disappearance, and shame thrives in silence. When we brought it into the open, it lost power. People still ask how I forgave him. The answer surprises them. I didn't forgive him because he apologized. I forgave him because I realized something about myself. I didn't collapse. I didn't stay widowed. I didn't protect his lie. I confronted it, and in doing so, I stopped being the woman who depended on his strength. I became the one who demanded it. A year after the grocery store aisle, we stood together at a lake, the same kind of lake where his fake accident had supposedly happened. It wasn't symbolic, it was intentional. Daniel skipped a stone across the surface. I never meant to hurt you, he said. I know, I replied. That doesn't make it okay. I know. Silence settled comfortably between us. Not heavy, not fragile, just quiet. I thought disappearing was brave. He said it wasn't. I replied gently. What was? Staying. He nodded slowly. And for the first time in a long time, I saw something steady in him. Not fear, not ego, responsibility. The day I saw my husband after his funeral, I thought I had lost him twice. I hadn't. The first loss was illusion. The second was pride. What remained was imperfect, but real, and sometimes real is stronger than perfect. Asterisk, he faked his death to save me. But the only thing that ever needed saving was his courage to stay alive and face the consequences.